A father's love has a price. Usually it's calculated in dowries, land, or titles. Mine was calculated in gambling debts. £3,000. That was what my father decided my virtue was worth when he marched me into the drawing-room of a man notorious for ruining everything he touched. He offered me as a distraction, a mistress, a pawn to clear his ledger. But the Duke didn't look at my father. He looked at me, cold and steady. The ink on the ledger was barely dry, but the numbers were already a death sentence. Clara sat in the freezing library of the Whitmore townhouse, a heavy wool shawl wrapped twice around her shoulders. She didn't bother lighting a fire. Coal cost money. Money was a memory in this house, much like the silver candlesticks that had vanished from the dining room last Tuesday, or the Persian rug that had conveniently gone out for cleaning a month ago. She traced the column of numbers with a cracked fingernail. Promissory notes. Debts of honor. The tailor, the butcher, the farrier. And then, at the very bottom, a sprawling, heavy-handed scrawl that made her stomach turn. £3,000 owed to the Duke of Montgomery. The library door clicked open. Lord Reginald Whitmore slipped into the room. He walked with the careful, deliberate steps of a man who had consumed exactly enough brandy to steady his nerves, but not quite enough to erase his shame. "Clara," he said. His voice was thin. It lacked the booming confidence it held 10 years ago, back when the Whitmore name meant something more than an unpaid tab at the gentleman's club. "The butcher won't deliver," Clara said, not looking up. She closed the ledger. The thud echoed in the sparse room. "We are boiling bones from Sunday, again." Reginald waved a hand dismissively, swaying slightly on his feet. The cuffs of his coat were frayed. "Minor inconveniences. Temporary. I have found a solution." Clara finally looked at him. She saw the nervous sweat beading at his temples despite the room's chill. She saw the way his eyes darted to the empty mantelpiece, refusing to meet hers. A cold, heavy dread settled at the base of her throat. "A solution," she repeated. The word tasted metallic. "The Duke of Montgomery," Reginald said, the name rushing out of him in one breath. Clara froze. Montgomery wasn't a man. He was a natural disaster. He owned half the coal mines in the north and operated in London society like a wolf among toy poodles. He didn't attend balls, he didn't dance, he foreclosed on estates and ruined men who couldn't pay their debts. He was ruthless, isolated, and profoundly dangerous. "You owe him £3,000, Clara said. Her voice was terrifyingly calm. "We do not have 300, we do not have 30. He came to me." Reginald took a step forward, his hands twitching at his sides. "His man of business, rather. The Duke is bored, Clara. He is an unmarried man of significant appetites. He finds society ladies tedious. He requires discretion, companionship." The word hung in the freezing air. Companionship. Clara stared at the man who had taught her how to ride a horse, who had bought her sugared plums when she was a child. He was looking at the floorboards. "You are selling me to clear your gambling debts. Do not be vulgar, Clara." Reginald snapped, a brief flash of hollow authority flaring before dying out. "It is an arrangement, a temporary one, 6 months, a year at most. You will live in luxury, you will want for nothing, and when it is done, the debt is forgiven, the estate is saved." As his whore. Reginald flinched. He covered his face with his trembling hands. "I am ruined, Clara. If he calls the debt, I go to debtor's prison. I will die there. You will be on the streets. What choice do we have? Look around you. There is nothing left." Clara looked around. He was right. There was nothing left. The house was a carcass, picked clean. And now she was the marrow. She didn't cry. Crying was for girls who believed their fathers were heroes. Clara had stopped believing that when she was 14. She stood up. The wool shawl slipped from her shoulders, pooling on the floor. "When?" she asked. "An hour," Reginald whispered into his hands. He expects us at his estate in an hour." Clara walked past him. She didn't slam the door. There was no energy left for dramatics. She walked upstairs to her room, opened her battered leather trunk, and began folding her few remaining decent dresses. The air in her bedroom was stale. She packed practically. Wool stockings, plain shifts, a heavy cloak. If she was to be a transaction, she would dress like a sensible one. She paused by the cracked vanity mirror. Her reflection stared back. Pale skin, dark, exhausted eyes, a sharp jawline that spoke of too many skipped meals. She wasn't a classical beauty. She didn't possess the soft, simpering curves the ton prized. She was sharp edges and quiet survival. £3,000, she whispered to the glass. She snapped the trunk shut. The carriage ride to Montgomery's London residence was suffocating. Reginald sat opposite her, reeking of stale gin and mint pastilles. He rehearsed his pitch under his breath, adjusting his cravat, trying to summon the ghost of his former aristocratic pride. Clara looked out the window. The streets of Mayfair blurred under a relentless, freezing rain. The gas lamps flickered, casting long, distorted shadows on the wet cobblestones. She felt entirely hollow. Her heart beat a slow, monotonous rhythm. Thump, thump, thump. Just another piece of machinery in a transaction. The carriage pulled up to a massive townhouse. It didn't look like a home. It looked like a fortress. Dark stone, minimal windows, an iron gate that groaned as the footman pushed it open. They were ushered inside by a butler whose face was carved from granite. The interior was as austere as the exterior. There were no gilded mirrors, no fragile porcelain vases, no velvet chaises. It smelled of beeswax, wood smoke, and cold ink. Everything was heavy, dark mahogany and dark leather. It was a house entirely devoid of softness. "The Duke will see you in his study," the butler intoned. Reginald wiped his brow with a handkerchief. He nodded, gesturing for Clara to follow. The study was cavernous. Books lined the walls from floor to ceiling, not for display, but clearly read, their spines cracked and worn. Behind a massive desk sat Sebastian Montgomery. Clara expected a villain from a penny, dreadful. She expected a man dripping with arrogant velvet, leering with a brandy glass in hand. Instead, she saw a man who looked bone-tired. Montgomery was in his 30s, with dark, unkempt hair that suggested he ran his hands through it in frustration rather than styling it. He wore a plain, dark waistcoat, his sleeves rolled up to the forearms. His fingers were smudged with ink. A thin, jagged scar cut through his left eyebrow, breaking the symmetry of a face that was brutally handsome in a completely unrefined way. He didn't stand when they entered. He didn't even look up from the document he was reading. "Whitmore," Montgomery said. His voice was a low, resonant rumble. It commanded the room without raising a decibel. "Your Grace." Reginald bowed entirely too low. It was a pathetic, grovelling movement. "I have brought her." Montgomery finally lifted his head. His eyes were dark, a startling, vivid grey that seemed to absorb the light in the room. He bypassed Reginald completely and let his gaze land on Clara. The silence stretched. It was a heavy, suffocating weight. Clara refused to lower her chin. She stared back at him. She didn't try to look seductive. She didn't try to look tragic. She just looked at him, letting him see the utter contempt she held for this entire proceeding. "Sit," Montgomery commanded. Reginald scrambled to a chair. Clara remained standing. "I told you to sit, Miss Whitmore," Montgomery said softly. "I prefer to stand while I am being appraised, Your Grace," Clara replied. Her voice was flat. "It saves time. You may check my teeth if you wish." Reginald gasped. "Clara, apologize at once." He turned to the Duke, sweating profusely. "Your Grace, I assure you she is usually quite biddable. She is merely overwhelmed. She is educated, well-read, and plays the pianoforte. She will be a most excellent companion for your quiet evenings." Montgomery leaned back in his chair. The leather creaked. He picked up a silver letter opener, turning it slowly in his ink-stained fingers. "A companion," Montgomery repeated. The word sounded absurd coming from his mouth. "Yes," Reginald babbled, sensing an opening. "Discreet. She understands the arrangement. The debt of £3,000 forgiven. She resides here, or at your country estate, at your pleasure. No demands, no complications." Montgomery's grey eyes never left Clara's face. He was searching for something. A tear, a plea for mercy, a tremble of the lip. She gave him nothing but a cold, stony glare. She would let him buy her body, but she would die before she let him have her dignity. "Lord Whitmore," Montgomery said quietly. "Yes, Your Grace." "You are a worm." The words were spoken without heat, merely stated as an absolute fact. Reginald choked on his own spit. Your Grace? You come into my house, reeking of cheap gin, and try to sell your own flesh and blood to settle a debt you accrued at a faro table." Montgomery dropped the letter opener onto the desk. The sharp clack made Reginald flinch. "You disgust me! Get out!" Reginald scrambled to his feet, panic contorting his face. "But the debt, the arrangement, you said you needed—" "I said, get out before I have my footman throw you into the street and call in your notes to the magistrates today." Reginald didn't look at Clara. He didn't say goodbye. He turned and fled the room, the heavy oak door slamming shut behind him. The silence rushed back into the room, thicker than before. Clara stood alone in the center of the Persian rug. The transaction had gone wrong. Her father had fled. She didn't know what was happening, but she knew she was entirely at the mercy of the man behind the desk. She gripped the handles of her reticule until her knuckles turned white. "If you are not accepting the arrangement, Your Grace, then I will follow my father." "Sit down, Clara." She didn't move. "I am not your dog." A ghost of a smile touched the corner of his mouth. It was gone in a fraction of a second. "No, you are not. Sit down before you fall down. You are shaking." She realized, with a surge of deep humiliation, that he was right. Her knees were trembling violently. The adrenaline of the confrontation was fading, leaving a sickening terror in its wake. She walked stiffly to the leather armchair her father had vacated and sat on the very edge of it. Montgomery watched her. He didn't speak for a long time. He pulled a fresh sheet of paper toward him, dipped a quill in ink, and began to write. Clara watched him, bewildered. Was he drawing up the foreclosure papers? Was he having her sent to prison in her father's stead? The scratch of the quill was maddening. "Are you going to ruin him?" Clara asked, her voice cracking slightly. She cleared her throat, hating the weakness. Montgomery didn't look up. "He ruined himself. I merely hold the paper." "Then why did you send for us?" Montgomery stopped writing. He set the quill down and folded his hands on the desk. He looked at her with an intensity that made her want to shrink back into the leather upholstery. "My man of business approached your father because I have a problem, Miss Whitmore, and you have a problem. I believed there might be a mutual solution. My problem is a £3,000 debt," Clara said. "What could a man who owns half of Yorkshire possibly lack?" "Peace," Montgomery said bluntly. "I lack peace." He stood up. He was incredibly tall, his frame broad and solid. He walked over to the fireplace, leaning his arm against the heavy stone mantel, staring into the low flames. "I am a duke," he began, his tone laced with exhaustion. "A wealthy one. Unmarried. Do you have any idea what that means in this city?" "I imagine it means you receive a lot of invitations," Clara said dryly. "It means I am hunted," he corrected. "Mothers thrusting their simpering daughters into my path. Dowagers cornering me at the few social events I am forced to attend. Men trying to pawn off their sisters, their nieces to secure my capital. It is endless, it is exhausting, and it interferes with my work." Clara frowned. "Your work?" My estates, my mines, my shipping lines, I manage them myself. I do not trust stewards. I do not trust society. He turned to look at her. I need a shield. I need a woman who can stand at the head of my table and freeze an ambitious mother at 20 paces. I need someone to manage the sprawling, chaotic mess of my domestic affairs so I can focus on my businesses. I need a partner who understands the absolute transactional nature of the world. Clara stared at him. The air in the room felt suddenly thin. My father offered me as a companion, a mistress. Your father is an idiot, Montgomery said flatly. I have no need for a mistress. I have no time to coddle a weeping girl forced into my bed. I require competence, not compliance. He walked back to the desk. He picked up the piece of paper he had just written on and slid it across the mahogany surface toward her. Clara leaned forward. It was a note, transferring the £3,000 debt from Reginald Whitmore to Sebastian Montgomery, stamped and marked paid in full. Next to it he placed a second document, a special license. It was blank, save for his signature at the bottom. Clara's breath hitched. She looked from the paper to him. I don't understand. I am proposing a business transaction, Clara, Montgomery said. Your father's debt is cleared. In exchange, you will marry me. The room tilted. Clara gripped the armrests of the chair. Marry you? Yes. You want me as your wife. I want you as my Duchess. Montgomery corrected, his voice dropping an octave, solid and immovable. You are broke. You are cynical. You did not shed a single tear when your father offered you like a piece of meat. You stared me down in my own study. You have a spine of steel, Miss Whitmore, and zero romantic illusions. You are exactly what I need. Clara let out a breath that was half a laugh, half a sob of sheer disbelief. You want to marry me because I am miserable and hard? I want to marry you because you are a survivor, he said. He leaned over the desk, his grey eyes locking onto hers. You will have unlimited funds to run my households. You will have independence. You will have absolute protection from men like your father. You will answer to no one but me, and I require very little. Manage the estates. Keep the ton away from me. That is the job. And the rest? She forced herself to ask, her cheeks burning. The heir. I have a cousin in Bath who will inherit the title. He is an irritating man, but competent enough. I have no desire to force myself on a woman who views me as a landlord. Our bedrooms will be separate. My life is my work. You will be my partner in managing the empire. Clara looked at the papers. £3,000. Her freedom. Her safety. In exchange for wearing a crown of cold iron, standing beside a man who admitted he only wanted her for her capacity to endure. It was the most honest proposal she had ever heard. She reached out and pulled the special license toward her. She picked up the quill. I prefer my tea without sugar, Clara said, her voice finally steady. And I require a budget for a new wardrobe. If I am to terrify London society on your behalf, I refuse to do it in worn wool. Montgomery's mouth twitched. This time, the smile reached his eyes. It made him look devastatingly human. Granted, he said. Sign the paper, Clara. She signed her name. The ink was dark and permanent. She pushed the paper back to him. He looked at the signature, nodded once, and carefully folded the document. He looked up at her, the transaction complete, the ledger balanced. Welcome to the firm, my Duchess. The transition from a debtor's daughter to a duchess did not happen with a grand ball or a shower of rose petals. It happened at 7 in the morning, over a ledger and a pot of black tea. Clara woke in a bed large enough to sleep 6, swallowed by a mattress so deep it felt like falling. The air in her new bedchamber was warm. A fire had been lit before dawn by a maid moving on silent feet. Clara stared at the dancing flames on the marble hearth. For the first time in 5 years, she was not cold. She did not luxuriate. The habit of survival was too deeply ingrained. She dressed herself in her plainest wool gown — the modiste was scheduled for noon — and walked downstairs. The London residence of Sebastian Montgomery was vast, silent, and aggressively masculine. It smelled of saddle soap and old paper. Clara navigated the broad oak staircase and found the domestic offices by following the distinct scent of fresh bread and the muffled clatter of silver. Mrs. Hughes, the housekeeper, was a woman of terrifying verticality. She wore black bombazine and a ring of heavy iron keys at her waist. She stood rigid when Clara entered the steward's room. "Your Grace," Mrs. Hughes said. Her tone was perfectly polite and entirely guarded. The staff knew the circumstances of the marriage. Servants always knew. They expected a terrified, weeping girl or a greedy social climber ready to demand new drapes and sack the lot of them. "Sit down, Mrs. Hughes," Clara said. She didn't wait for the housekeeper to comply. Clara took the chair at the head of the heavy oak table, pulling the leather-bound household books toward her. She opened the top one. The ink was neat, the columns orderly. "The Duke informed me that he has left the domestic running of this house entirely to you and Mr. Davies," Clara said, running a finger down the column of grocery expenses. "He has, Your Grace. His Grace prefers not to be bothered with trivialities." "I am the triviality now," Clara said flatly. She didn't look up. "Which means you report to me. I see here we are paying 6p a pound for sugar. The market rate dropped to 4p last month. The grocer is padding the bill, relying on the fact that a Duke's steward will not haggle." Mrs. Hughes stiffened. "Mr. Davies has used the same grocer for 10 years. Then Mr. Davies has been overpaying for 10 years. Clara closed the book. The heavy thud echoed in the small room. She finally looked up, meeting the housekeeper's wary gaze. "We are wealthy, Mrs. Hughes. We are not stupid. Instruct Mr. Davies to inform the grocer that he will adjust his prices to the market rate, or we will take our custom elsewhere. I want the butchery and coal accounts on my desk by noon." Mrs. Hughes stared at her. The rigid posture softened by a fraction of an inch. A glimmer of something akin to respect sparked in the older woman's eyes. This was not a weeping girl. This was a manager. "Yes, Your Grace. Furthermore," Clara continued, her voice even, "the Duke requires absolute quiet in the East Wing until he emerges for breakfast. I noticed 2 maids chatting outside his study this morning. It will not happen again. He is building an empire. We are building the walls around him. Are we clear?" "Perfectly, Your Grace." By the time Sebastian Montgomery descended the stairs 2 hours later, his house had shifted. He paused in the foyer. Something was different. The perpetual, low-level chaos of a massive staff operating without a master seemed to have vanished. A footman stood at strict attention by the door. The brass on the sconces gleamed with aggressive polish. He found Clara in the morning room. She was surrounded by swatches of heavy silk, velvet, and dark linen. A modiste and 3 assistants hovered around her like nervous hummingbirds. Clara stood on a small stool, her arms raised, while a woman pinned a length of midnight blue velvet to her shoulder. "No lace," Clara was saying. Her voice was firm. "I am not a debutante. I do not wish to look like a pastry, structural lines, high collars. I want fabrics that hold their shape. Emerald, sapphire, black." "But Your Grace," the modiste fluttered, "it is the height of the season. Pastels are—" "I do not care about the season. I care about the impression. Make me look like a fortress, madame." Sebastian leaned against the doorframe, crossing his arms over his chest. He watched her. She was entirely in her element, commanding the room with a cold, terrifying efficiency. She didn't look at the fabrics with vanity. She looked at them like armor. Clara caught his reflection in the standing mirror. She didn't jump. She simply turned her head. "Your Grace," she said. "Madam," he replied, pushing off the doorframe and walking into the room. The modiste and her assistants immediately dropped into deep curtsies, trembling slightly under his dark gaze. Sebastian ignored them. He walked until he was standing just below Clara's stool. He reached out and took a swatch of heavy, blood-red silk from a nearby table. He held it up against the midnight blue velvet currently pinned to her. "Add this one," he said to the modiste, his eyes never leaving Clara's face. "The Duchess will wear red. It suits a woman who knows how to draw blood." Clara arched an eyebrow. "I thought the point was to keep society at a distance, not challenge them to a duel. Why not both?" Sebastian murmured. He dropped the silk onto the table. "You have managed the staff. Davies is currently sweating over the coal accounts in his office, muttering about your terrifying grasp of mathematics. Math is merely the language of truth, Montgomery. Numbers do not lie. People do." He nodded slowly. A deep, resonant satisfaction settled in his chest. He had bought a shield, yes, but he was beginning to realize he had also bought a sword. "We dine at Lady Carlisle's tonight," he announced. "Our first public appearance. Can your fortress be constructed by 8 o'clock? Clara looked at the modiste, who squeaked an affirmative. She looked back down at her husband. "It will be ready," Clara said. "Prepare yourself, Montgomery. I intend to earn my keep." The Carlisle ballroom was a suffocating sea of heavy perfume, overheated bodies, and vicious whispers. Sebastian hated it. He hated the way the candlelight caught the greedy gleam in the eyes of the mothers who tracked his every movement. He hated the sycophantic lords who tried to corner him near the punch bowl to pitch terrible investments in canal routes. Usually he stood in the darkest corner he could find, scowling until people left him alone. Tonight he did not stand in a corner. He stood near the center of the room, and he did not have to scowl. Clara was doing the work for him. She wore the midnight blue velvet. It was entirely devoid of lace or ruffles. It clung to her upper body with rigid precision before flaring into a heavy, structured skirt. The blood-red silk was woven into the lining of her sleeves, flashing like a warning every time she moved her arms. She wore no diamonds. The only jewelry she permitted was a heavy, antique silver necklace that looked more like a collar of armor than a decoration. She was not beautiful in the soft, yielding way society prized. She was striking. She was sharp. "Your Grace!" Sebastian felt his jaw clench. Approaching them with the velocity of a cannonball was Lady Ponsonby, a woman notorious for her relentless matchmaking and her total lack of social boundaries. Trailing behind her like a frightened dinghy was her youngest daughter, a girl who looked entirely too prone to weeping. "Duke Montgomery! What a surprise!" Lady Ponsonby crowed, her eyes darting over Clara with naked calculation. "And this must be the new Duchess. So sudden. We were all quite shocked. Were you?" Clara asked. Her voice cut through the surrounding chatter like a blade on ice. She didn't smile. She didn't offer her hand. She merely looked at Lady Ponsonby with a gaze so blank and unyielding it bordered on clinical. Lady Ponsonby faltered, her painted smile twitching. "Well, yes, one rarely hears of a duke marrying so quietly. And to a Whitmore. Your father, I hear, has retired to the country." It was a deliberate barb, a reminder of her father's ruin and her own previously desperate status. Sebastian shifted his weight, preparing to step in, to crush the woman's rudeness as he normally would. Clara didn't need him. "My father's whereabouts are entirely his own concern, Lady Ponsonby," Clara said evenly. "Just as my husband's choices are his own. However, if you are attempting to imply that our marriage lacks the theatricality of a prolonged society courtship, you are correct. My husband is a man of industry, not a fop. He values efficiency. I am efficient." Lady Ponsonby blinked, entirely derailed. I merely meant—" "I know exactly what you meant," Clara interrupted smoothly. "Now, I note your daughter has been standing in the draught of the terrace door for 5 minutes and appears to be developing a chill. As a mother, your priority should surely be her health, rather than interrogating my husband's schedule. Good evening." Clara turned her back on the woman. It was a fluid, utterly dismissive movement. She placed her hand lightly on Sebastian's forearm and steered him away, leaving Lady Ponsonby staring after them, her mouth opening and closing like a landed trout. Sebastian let himself be led. When they were out of earshot, a low, rough laugh escaped his chest. It was a sound he rarely made, scraping against his ribs. "Efficient," he repeated, looking down at her. Clara kept her eyes on the crowd, her posture perfect. "You requested a shield. I merely deflected the projectile." "You gutted her." "She lacked the intelligence to recognize a closed door. I simply slammed it on her fingers." Clara glanced up at him. "Are there any others you require me to dispatch?" Sebastian looked around the ballroom. Word of Lady Ponsonby's public execution was already rippling through the crowd. Mothers were subtly shifting their daughters away from their path. Lords with bad investments were suddenly finding the ceiling frescoes fascinating. The usual predatory gaze of the Tarn had turned into a wary, respectful distance. He looked back at his wife. Her profile was sharp, her expression bored. She was treating the height of the London season exactly as she treated a miscalculated grocery ledger, as a problem to be corrected with cold logic. "No," Sebastian said softly, realizing he was actually breathing easily in a ballroom for the first time in a decade. "I believe they understand the new management." "Excellent." Clara released his arm. "Then I am going to find something to eat. Managing your social terrors works up an appetite, and I refuse to starve in a room full of roasted meats." She walked away, parting the crowd simply by existing in her heavy velvet and absolute indifference. Sebastian watched her go. He reached into his coat pocket, his fingers brushing the small velvet box he had carried all day. He hadn't given her a ring yet. The marriage had been too fast, a paper transaction. He watched her pick up a plate and methodically select a piece of duck. He didn't want a weeping bride. He didn't want romance. He wanted a partner. And watching Clara Whitmore eat roast duck while half of high society trembled in her wake, Sebastian Montgomery realized he had made the best investment of his entire God-forsaken life. London was a battlefield, but Yorkshire was a factory. A month after the Carlisle ball, the Montgomery carriage rolled up the immense gravel driveway of Ashbourne Hall. The London season had been effectively neutralized. Clara had spent 4 weeks freezing the blood of any social climber foolish enough to approach her husband. She had reorganized his townhouse, terrified his steward into absolute honesty, and secured a reputation as the Ice Duchess. But Ashbourne was different. The estate sat on the edge of the moors, a sprawling, dark stone monolith that looked as though it had grown directly out of the harsh northern earth. The air here didn't smell of perfume and carriage exhaust. It smelled of damp heather, coal dust, and rain. Clara stood on the front steps, the wind pulling at her heavy woolen cloak. She breathed in deeply. It was a cold, unforgiving landscape. She liked it immediately. "It isn't pretty," Sebastian said, coming to stand beside her. He looked out over the rolling, dark hills. "The mines are 3 miles that way. The mills are in the valley. The soot reaches the windows on a windy day. I did not marry you for a view, Montgomery," Clara said, turning toward the massive oak doors. "Let us see the ledgers." The rhythm of their life in Yorkshire established itself with brutal efficiency. There were no balls, there were no callers, there was only the estate. Sebastian worked in the main library, a room dominated by a massive mahogany desk covered in maps of coal veins and shipping manifests. On their second day, Clara had a smaller desk moved into the room. She placed it near the tall windows, perpendicular to his. She didn't ask permission. She simply directed 2 sweating footmen to position it, set out her inkwell, and requested the tenant dispute records. Sebastian had paused his reading to watch her. He hadn't objected. For weeks, they worked in the same room, enveloped in a thick, comfortable silence. The only sounds were the scratching of quills, the crackle of the massive fire in the hearth, and the occasional rustle of parchment. They were two cogs in a massive machine, operating in perfect synchronization without ever touching. Clara found the work fascinating. Her father's debts had taught her the terror of numbers, but Sebastian's ledgers taught her the power of them. She managed the vast network of tenant farms, authorizing repairs, calculating yields, and ruthlessly cutting out middlemen who were siphoning profits from the grain sales. She was good at it. For the first time in her life, her sharp mind was an asset, not a liability to be hidden behind a fan. It happened on a Tuesday in late November. The wind was howling against the thick glass of the library windows, driving a fierce sleet against the panes. The room was dark, lit only by the fire and the oil lamps on their respective desks. It was past midnight. Clara was rubbing her temples, staring at a discrepancy in the brickyard accounts. The numbers were blurring together. Her eyes burned. She had skipped dinner, too focused on unraveling a foreman's creative accounting. She reached for her teacup. It was empty. It had been empty for hours, she sighed, a quiet, exhausted sound in the silent room, and picked up her quill again. A shadow fell over her desk. Clara looked up. Sebastian was standing beside her. He didn't say a word. He simply reached out and placed a fresh, steaming cup of tea on her blotter. Next to it, he set a small plate holding 2 thick slices of buttered bread and a wedge of sharp cheddar. Clara stared at the food. The steam from the tea curled into the cold air. She looked up at him. His collar was unbuttoned, his cravat discarded hours ago. His dark hair was a mess from him running his hands through it. The jagged scar through his eyebrow caught the lamplight. "You did not eat," Sebastian said. His voice was low, gravelly from disuse. "I was finishing the brickyard tallies," Clara replied, her voice equally quiet. "The mud will still be there tomorrow, Clara." He didn't walk away. He leaned a hip against the edge of her desk, crossing his arms. He looked down at the open ledger. "Foreman is skimming?" he asked. 10% on the transport costs," Clara said, picking up the teacup. The ceramic was incredibly warm against her cold fingers. She took a sip. It was strong, black, exactly how she liked it. "He's logging 2 wagons for every delivery, but the toll road receipts only show 1. Fire him tomorrow," Sebastian said. "I already drafted the letter. Mr. Davies will deliver it at dawn." Sebastian looked at her, really looked at her. He saw the dark circles under her eyes, the smudge of ink on her chin, the absolute, unyielding focus in her posture. She wasn't wearing velvet or silk. She was wearing a plain, heavy wool gown, wrapped in a shawl, tearing apart a corrupt foreman with mathematical precision. She took a bite of the bread and cheese. She closed her eyes for a brief second as the calories hit her system. It was an unguarded, deeply human gesture. Sebastian felt a strange, heavy shifting in his chest. It wasn't the frantic, heated rush of desire the poets wrote about. It was slower, deeper, like a foundation settling into solid earth. "Why do you work until you break, Clara?" he asked softly. Clara stopped chewing. She opened her eyes. The firelight flickered in the dark depths of her gaze. She looked at the tea, at the fire, and then up at the man who had brought her out of hell. "Because hunger is a very long memory, Montgomery," she said frankly. "And I prefer to ensure the walls of this fortress are impenetrable. For both of us." She expected him to nod, to accept the business logic, and return to his desk. Instead, Sebastian reached out. His large, ink-stained hand hovered for a second, before his fingers gently brushed her jawline, his thumb wiping the smudge of ink from her chin. The contact was shocking. His skin was warm, his touch surprisingly gentle for a man who tore the earth apart for a living. Clara froze. She stopped breathing. Sebastian didn't linger. He dropped his hand, stepping back from the desk. "The walls are thick enough for tonight, Clara," he said. The roughness in his voice had smoothed out into something dangerously close to tenderness. Go to sleep. He turned and walked back to his side of the room. He sat down, pulled a map toward him, and did not look up again. Clara sat by the window, the half-eaten bread in her hand, the warmth of his thumb still burning against her skin. The transaction had shifted. The ledger was no longer perfectly balanced. She looked out at the dark, freezing moors, and for the first time in her life, she felt entirely safe. The winter of 1842 did not just freeze Yorkshire. It turned the land to iron. The ground was solid, unyielding, and crusted with a permanent layer of frost. Inside Ashbourne Hall, the fires roared, and the great estate machinery hummed under Clara's hand. The ledgers were balanced. The staff was flawless. The business of being the Duke and Duchess of Montgomery operated with the cold, frictionless perfection of a well-oiled locomotive. Then the earth broke open. It happened on a Thursday in late January. The sky was the color of a bruised plum. Clara was in the morning room, checking the grain inventory, when the massive iron bell in the courtyard began to ring. It was not the rhythmic tolling of a visitor. It was frantic, uneven, panicked. Clara dropped her pen. The ink splattered across the page. She was in the hallway before the final echo of the bell faded, her heavy boots clattering against the marble floor. Sebastian was already at the front doors. He was shoving his arms into a heavy leather coat. His face was a mask of absolute, terrifying stone. Mr. Davies stood beside him, clutching a piece of paper, his hands trembling violently. "Which pit?" Sebastian barked. Number 4, Your Grace," Davies stammered. A support beam gave way in the lower gallery. The water is coming in." "How many men down?" 50, maybe 60. The shift was changing." Sebastian didn't say another word. He didn't look back. He tore open the front doors and vaulted onto the dark gelding a stable boy had hurriedly brought around, galloping down the drive before the horse was fully saddled. Clara stood in the doorway. The freezing wind whipped her skirts around her ankles. She watched him disappear into the grey mist. Panic was a luxury. Clara could not afford it. She spun around. Mrs. Hughes was standing at the base of the stairs, her face entirely pale. The rest of the staff hovered behind her, wide-eyed and paralyzed. "Mrs. Hughes," Clara said. Her voice cut through the foyer like a whip crack. It was loud, precise, and devoid of fear. "I want the laundry maids to tear every spare sheet in the west wing into bandages. Have the kitchen boil water, every pot. I want broth, strong tea, and bread loaded into the wagons." "Your Grace." "Now, Mrs. Hughes, Davis!" Clara snapped, turning to the steward. "Send a rider to Dr. Wallace in the village. Tell him to meet me at Pit 4. If he argues, tell him the Duke will personally burn his clinic to the ground. Move." The paralysis broke. The house exploded into action. An hour later, Clara sat in the back of an open wagon, surrounded by crates of medical supplies, blankets, and steaming vats of broth. The road to the mine was rutted and frozen. Every jolt jarred her spine. She didn't feel it. Her mind was a singular, focused point of execution. They crested the ridge. Pit 4 sat in the valley below. It was a vision of hell. Thick, choking black smoke billowed from the auxiliary vents. The massive wooden winch gears were screaming, hauling up cages at a frantic, terrifying speed. Hundreds of people, women with shawls pulled over their heads, crying children, off-duty miners covered in yesterday's soot, pressed against the wooden barricades. The noise was deafening. Wailing, shouting, the mechanical roar of the pumps fighting a losing battle against the floodwaters. Clara jumped down from the wagon before it fully stopped. "Clear a path!" she shouted to the footman. "Get this cart to the headhouse." She waded into the chaos. The women of the village recognized her. They recognized the midnight blue cloak, the unyielding posture. They parted, a sea of terrified faces giving way to the Duchess. Clara reached the pithead, just as a cage violently rattled to the surface. The iron gates were thrown open. Men poured out. They were covered in thick black slurry. Some were limping, some were carrying bodies. The smell of copper blood and sulphur hit Clara like a physical blow. She looked for Sebastian. She didn't see a duke. She saw a massive man in a ruined leather coat, covered head to toe in coal dust, his bare hands gripping the iron bars of the cage. He was hauling men out, his shoulders straining against the weight, shouting orders over the roar of the steam engines. "Get the injured to the carts! Wallace, where is the goddamn doctor?" Sebastian roared, his voice hoarse. "Here!" Clara shouted back. Sebastian whipped his head around. His face was unrecognizable, smeared with black mud, but his grey eyes pierced through the gloom. He saw her standing beside the supply wagon, her sleeves rolled up, a roll of bandages already in her hand. He didn't yell at her to go home. He didn't tell her it was no place for a woman. He gave her a single tight nod. "Triaging the wounded, Clara. Those bleeding go to you. Those shivering go to the fires." Understood. For 6 hours, the world ceased to exist. There were no ledgers. There were no social climbers. There was only ripped flesh, shattered bone, and the relentless, freezing mud. Clara worked like a machine. She bound up crushed hands. She wiped soot from the eyes of crying boys barely old enough to hold a pickaxe. She poured hot tea down the throats of men shivering so violently their teeth cracked. Her blue velvet cloak was stained black with soot and rust red with blood. Her hands were numb. Every time the cage went down, Sebastian went with it. He was leading the rescue parties himself. He refused to send men where he would not go. He descended into the dark, into the rising water, pulling out the trapped, the injured, and the dead. It was dusk when the final cage came up. The main pump had failed. The lower gallery was entirely submerged. There was no one left to save. Sebastian stepped off the iron grate. He was swaying. His coat was gone. His shirt was torn to rags, and a deep, ugly gash ran down his left forearm, bleeding freely into the black mud on his skin. He looked at the row of bodies laid out under tarpaulins. 12 men. It was a tragedy. But against a collapse of that magnitude, it was a miracle of leadership. He didn't speak to the foreman. He didn't look at the crowd. He walked straight toward Clara. She had just finished wrapping a miner's cracked ribs. She stood up, her back aching violently, and watched her husband approach. He stopped a foot away from her. The adrenaline was draining out of him, leaving behind pure, crushing exhaustion. He looked down at her. He saw the blood on her clothes, the soot on her cheek, the fierce, unyielding light in her eyes. "It's done," he rasped. Clara looked at his bleeding arm. She looked at the tremor in his massive, ink-stained hands. She felt a sudden, terrifying crack in the ice that had protected her heart for 5 years. He wasn't a ruthless transaction. He was a man who bled for his people, and she was entirely, helplessly anchored to him. "Get in the wagon, Montgomery," Clara said. Her voice shook, just once. "I am taking you home." The ride back to Ashbourne was silent. The estate was eerily quiet, the staff hovering in the shadows, waiting for news. Clara bypassed them all. "Bring hot water to the Duke's chambers," she ordered Mrs. Hughes as they crossed the foyer. "Bandages, carbolic acid, and a bottle of whiskey. And then leave us. Do not send a valet. Do not send a maid." "Yes, Your Grace." Clara followed Sebastian up the stairs. He was moving heavily, his hand gripping the banister. He pushed open the door to his bedchamber and collapsed into the leather chair by the hearth. He closed his eyes. His breathing was shallow and ragged. Clara shut the door behind them. The click of the lock echoed in the massive room. She walked over to him. She didn't ask permission. She knelt on the floor between his parted knees. "Take off the shirt," she said. Sebastian opened his eyes. They were completely drained. He tried to lift his left arm, but a sharp hiss of pain escaped his teeth. He dropped his arm back to his side. Clara didn't hesitate. She took the ruined collar of his linen shirt in both hands and ripped it down the seam. The fabric gave way. She peeled the damp, freezing material off his shoulders. His torso was covered in bruises, ugly, blossoming patches of purple and black where falling rock had struck him. But the worst was his forearm. A jagged piece of timber had sliced through the muscle. It was deep, angry, and packed with coal dust. A knock sounded at the door. Clara rose, opened it a crack, and took the heavy silver basin of steaming water and the tray of supplies from a footman. She kicked the door shut again. She set the basin on a small table near the chair. She poured a generous measure of whiskey into a glass and handed it to him. "Drink," she ordered. Sebastian took the glass with his good hand and drained it in a single swallow. The burn brought a little colour back to his ashen face. Clara took a clean linen cloth, dipped it in the hot, soapy water, and knelt before him again. "This is going to hurt," she said. "I know." She began to wash him. She was not gentle, because gentleness would not get the toxic coal dust out of the wound. She scrubbed the black slurry from his chest, his throat, his uninjured arm. The water in the basin turned instantly black. She poured it out into a bucket, refilled the bowl from the heavy iron kettle by the fire, and continued. Sebastian watched her. He watched her hands, small, capable, stained with the grime of his mines. He watched the tense set of her jaw. He watched the way she didn't flinch from the blood. She picked up the bottle of carbolic acid. "Brace yourself," she murmured. She poured the acid directly over the gash on his arm. Sebastian's entire body went rigid. His jaw locked. His right hand shot out, gripping Clara's shoulder with bruising force. He didn't cry out, but the breath hissed violently through his teeth. Clara didn't pull away. She let him hold on to her. Her own hand steady it, she wiped away the frothing blood and began to tightly wrap the white linen bandages around his forearm, tying it off with precise, brutal efficiency. When she finished, she sat back on her heels. The silence stretched. The fire crackled in the hearth. Sebastian slowly released her shoulder. His hand dropped, his fingers brushing against her collarbone before falling to his lap. "Why did you come to the pit?" he asked. His voice was a low rumble in the quiet room. Clara looked at her ruined skirt. "You required supplies. The men required triage. I am asking why you came, Clara. You could have sent Davies. You could have stayed by the fire." Clara looked up. She met his grey eyes. There was no place to hide anymore. The transaction was dead. It had died somewhere in the freezing mud of Pit 4. "Because you were there," Clara said simply. "And I realized I could balance your ledgers, I could manage your staff, and I could freeze out London society. But if you did not come out of that earth, I would have nothing left. You are my fortress, Sebastian. I was not going to let the walls fall." It was the first time she had used his Christian name. It hung in the air, heavy and intimate. Sebastian stared at her. The bone-deep exhaustion in his face shifted into something intensely focused. He leaned forward, ignoring the pain in his ribs. He reached into the pocket of his discarded, ruined trousers lying on the floor. He pulled out a small, soot-stained velvet box. He opened it. Inside was not a diamond. It was a ring of solid, dark iron, inset with a single, deeply coloured sapphire. It was heavy. It was unyielding. It was exactly like them. "I had it forged a month ago," Sebastian said softly. "I carried it every day. I didn't give it to you because I didn't know how to ask a woman who values independence above all things to surrender the rest of herself to me." He took the ring from the box. He held it between his thumb and forefinger. "I don't want a companion anymore, Clara," he said, his voice raw. "I don't want a manager. I want a wife. I want the woman who stood in the mud and blood and held my empire together. I want you." Clara's throat tightened. The cynical, hardened shell she had worn for 5 years finally, irrevocably cracked. She didn't offer her left hand. She raised both her hands, framing his battered, soot-stained face. She felt the rough stubble on his jaw, the heat of his skin. "Then put the ring on my finger, Montgomery," she whispered, "and take me." Sebastian's breath caught. He slid the heavy iron and sapphire ring onto her finger. It fit perfectly. It felt like an anchor. He didn't hesitate. His right hand slid to the back of her neck, tangling in her loose hair, and he pulled her up. He kissed her. It wasn't a polite, aristocratic pressing of lips. It was desperate. It tasted of whiskey, smoke, and the sheer, overwhelming relief of survival. Clara kissed him back with equal ferocity. She knelt up, pressing her body against his chest, mindful of his broken ribs, but needing the solid, physical proof that he was alive. He pulled her into his lap, burying his face in the crook of her neck, inhaling the scent of carbolic soap and cold rain on her skin. He wrapped his good arm around her waist, holding her with a possessiveness that had nothing to do with ownership and everything to do with devotion. That night, there were no separate bedrooms. There was only the heat of the fire, the tangle of sheets, and the quiet, profound dismantling of the walls they had built around themselves. They found an intimacy carved from mutual endurance. Clara mapping the scars on his back, Sebastian learning the soft, hidden sounds she made when her control finally slipped. They had started as a transaction. They woke up as an empire. Spring arrived in Yorkshire not with a gentle bloom, but with a violent thawing of the mud. By April, the mines were fully operational again. The structural braces had been replaced with steel. The widows of Pit 4 had been placed on full pensions, an order Clara had written and Sebastian had signed without a word of debate. They were working in the library. It was early afternoon. The sunlight streaming through the tall windows was actually warm. Clara sat at her desk, the heavy iron ring on her left hand glinting as she turned a page in the shipping manifests. Sebastian sat opposite her, reviewing a surveyor's map. The heavy oak doors opened. Mr. Davies stepped inside. He looked incredibly uncomfortable. "Forgive the interruption, Your Graces," Davies said, clearing his throat. "But there is a caller." Sebastian didn't look up from his map. "I told you, Davies, we are not receiving. Tell whoever it is that the Duke is dead and the Duchess is busy." "I attempted to refuse him, Your Grace," Davies said, shifting his weight. "But he insists. He says he is family." Clara's quill stopped moving. A cold drop of ink pooled on the parchment. "Who is it, Davies?" Clara asked, her voice dangerously quiet. "Lord Reginald Whitmore, Your Grace." Sebastian's head snapped up. His grey eyes narrowed, the relaxed posture of a moment ago vanishing instantly. He looked at Clara. Clara slowly placed her quill back in its holder. She didn't tremble. She didn't pale. The girl who had shivered in a freezing London library was gone. "Show him in, Davies," Clara said. "Clara," Sebastian warned, his voice a low rumble. "I can have him thrown into the nearest bog. You do not have to see him." "I know I don't," she said calmly, standing up and smoothing the skirts of her dark green day dress. "But I wish to." A moment later, Reginald Whitmore entered the library. He looked exactly the same, yet somehow smaller. He wore a coat that was attempting to be fashionable but was clearly a season out of date. He carried a silver-tipped cane he didn't need. He paused just inside the door, his eyes darting around the magnificent room, taking in the wealth, the power, and finally, his daughter. "Clara, my dear girl!" Reginald boomed, putting on a smile that looked like a poorly fitted mask. He took a step forward, his arms open. Clara did not move. She stood behind her desk. "Lord Whitmore?" she said. The temperature in the room dropped 10 degrees. Reginald's arms fell to his sides. He coughed, looking nervously at Sebastian, who remained seated but was watching Reginald with the idle, terrifying patience of a predator deciding where to bite first. I was travelling north," Reginald stammered. "I thought it only right to look in on my daughter, to see how you are adjusting to your arrangement." "I am adjusting perfectly," Clara said flatly. "State your business." Reginald feigned offence, placing a hand over his chest. Business? Clara, I am your father. Cannot a father visit his child? Though, I must admit, the journey was arduous, and the lodgings in the village are frightfully expensive. I find myself temporarily embarrassed for funds. A mere loan of £500? No, the word was a bullet. Reginald blinked. I beg your pardon? No, Clara repeated. She walked around her desk. She didn't rush. She paced toward him with measured, deliberate steps until she was standing 3 feet away. You do not get to come here, Clara said, her voice dripping with absolute contempt. You do not get to sell me like a prized mare to clear your gambling debts, abandon me in a stranger's house, and then come knocking on my door expecting a return on your investment. Clara, you forget yourself, Reginald snapped, a desperate anger flaring. I gave you life. I gave you a name. You are the Duchess of Montgomery. Because of me, I arranged this. You arranged a disaster, Clara countered, her voice finally rising, echoing off the high ceilings. You arranged my ruin. It was only through the grace of a man entirely better than you that I was not discarded. You did not give me an empire, father. You threw me to the wolves, and you are merely upset that I learned how to lead the pack. Reginald turned red, his hands shaking. He looked past her to Sebastian. Your Grace, surely you will not allow your wife to speak to her father this way. Family is earned. Sebastian interrupted. His voice was quiet, but it commanded the room completely. He finally stood up. He walked slowly to stand shoulder to shoulder with Clara. He didn't look at Reginald. He looked at his wife. Profound pride etched into the harsh lines of his face. You heard the Duchess, Sebastian said, finally turning his grey eyes on the older man. You are an intruder in her home. If I see your face in Yorkshire again, I will not call the magistrates. I will drop you down one of my ventilation shafts. Reginald swallowed hard. The remaining fight drained out of him. He looked at Clara one last time. He found no mercy there, only the cold, unyielding iron of a woman who had survived him. He turned on his heel and hurried out of the library. The heavy doors clicked shut behind him. The silence rushed back in. Clara stood rigid for a moment, her chest heaving slightly. Sebastian placed a hand on the small of her back. His touch was warm, grounding. Are you all right? He asked softly. Clara let out a long breath. She leaned back against him, letting his solid frame support her weight. The ghost of her past had tried to haunt her, and she had exorcised it completely. I am, she said. She turned her head, looking up at him. A genuine, relaxed smile finally broke across her face. Though I believe I just saved you £500, you should add it to the brickyard budget. Sebastian let out a rough bark of laughter. He wrapped both arms around her, pulling her back against his chest, resting his chin on the top of her head. Always managing the ledger, my Duchess. Someone has to ensure the empire remains profitable. Clara murmured, turning in his arms and resting her hands on his chest, feeling the steady, powerful rhythm of his heart beneath the linen. The price of iron is high. Worth every penny, Sebastian replied, leaning down to capture her lips. They stood in the sunlight, the master and the manager, the shield and the sword. The ledger was closed, the debts were paid, and the transaction had become the greatest love story either of them had ever known. And that brings us to the end of Clara and Sebastian's story. From a cold, transactional arrangement to a partnership forged in iron and survival, they proved that true love isn't about grand romantic gestures, but choosing each other when the walls fall down. If you loved this deeply emotional, grounded Regency tale, please smash that like button. Share this video with someone who loves a capable, fierce heroine and a grumpy, fiercely protective duke. And don't forget to subscribe and leave a comment below telling me your favorite moment from their story. See you in the next one.